Well, great. Thank you very much, Fred, and welcome to everybody. I am, of course, glad to present this book. For those of you that know me well, you know that I have, in the past, been averse to PowerPoint presentations. But my two sons, Nick and Nathaniel, have pushed me to overcome these Luddite tendencies. When I returned home one Friday afternoon a couple weeks ago, they presented me with a PowerPoint presentation on why they should be allowed to go to the movies without a parent chaperone. So if they can do this in the spirit of father-son competition, so can I. Now, this book is a return to a topic that Mac Dessler and I addressed in our book, Dollar Politics, in 1989, my first publication for the Institute. There, Mac and I advanced a favorable view of the role of Congress during the fights over exchange rate policy during the mid-1980s and argued that its actions had a salutary corrective effect on the policies of the Reagan administration. We also detailed the origins of the exchange rate provisions and reporting requirements of the 1988 Trade Act. Now, the conflict over Chinese exchange rate policy, as Fred has mentioned, over the last 3 years has placed the spotlight again on relations between Congress and the executive. It has generated a flurry of congressional proposals to reduce Treasury's discretion in finding currency manipulation and provide compelling incentives for manipulators to desist. To give some perspective and inform possible legislation, this book reviews the 20 years of Treasury reports and Congress's follow-up on them. And to preview the conclusion briefly, I argue that the reports have sometimes been lacking, in not designating China for manipulation, and that Congress has continued to play a constructive role. If anything, Congress should follow up more vigorously on the exchange rate reports. Now, I realize that I'm going to have to go out and make a lot of new friends to compensate for the ones that I'm losing as a result of this book. For my next project, I think I'll choose a topic that's more positive sum in nature so I can make everybody happy. I want to point out at the outset that my prior publications have vigorously defended the institutional position of the Treasury. My piece on the Exchange Stabilization Fund rebutted proposals from people like Alan Meltzer to eliminate the ESF or restrict Treasury's use of it. But while I want a strong Treasury, with strength comes an obligation to adhere to an accountability procedure in a forthcoming way, and that is what this book is about. I'll organize the presentation under the following headings. First, a discussion of the central problem. Does this work? Have I managed? There we go. First, a discussion of the central problem. Second, the accountability framework. Third, the empirical findings. And finally, the recommendations. Now, stepping back from the specific issue area of exchange rate policy for a moment, the problem posed here takes a general form, one of institutional design. How can a principal, the Congress, delegate policy authority to an agent, the Treasury Department, while minimizing what is known as agency losses or bureaucratic drift? That is, deviation on the part of the agent from the preferences of the principal. The large asymmetry in expertise in favor of Treasury compounds this problem from Congress's perspective. There's a long tradition in political science and social sciences more generally in the study of this asymmetry going back to Max Weber's work on bureaucracy. And the problem is pervasive in American government. Now, there are two responses to this central problem, a technocratic answer and a political one. In the technocratic view, bureaucratic drift is good, and congressional mandates and oversight on exchange rate policy are counterproductive because members don't understand this issue area. They can be captured by special interest groups and grandstand and demagogue to impress voters. Their attention waxes and wanes. They're sometimes simply protectionist. And the logical implication, if you take this line of argument to an extreme, is that the original assignment of exchange rate policy to the Congress by the U.S. Constitution is just an inconvenient artifact of American political history. And by extension, the exchange rate provisions of the 1988 Trade Act were perhaps just a mistake, a concession to prevent Congress from doing something even worse. Now, this view actually is fairly commonly expressed in policy discussions in which I've taken part around town. The view is less often written because my friends that hold this view are conflicted between their technocratic tendencies and democratic principles. My view is more political. By the Constitution, as I've mentioned, Congress is the ultimate source of authority on exchange rate policy, and rather than bemoan its involvement in this issue and hope that it goes away, we should recognize that Congress is likely to be more rather than less involved as the U.S. economy becomes more open. The days when Treasury might wish to operate under Congress's radar screen are probably gone for good, and our focus should be to build a functional relationship between the two. Grandstanding irritates me. But it's ultimately beside the point. The behavior of the institution as a whole is key. I don't approve of some of the constraints that Congress has placed on Treasury with respect to the IMF and temporarily with respect to the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But on exchange rate policy per se, Congress has been responsible, limiting its role to defining objectives, exercising oversight, and requiring some transparency. Notably, congressional activism has never pushed the exchange rate away from equilibrium levels, always toward them, and there are fundamental political economy reasons for this. As a matter of principle, I want outsiders checking up on executive agencies' adherence to their mandates, and since Congress exercises oversight, it's the best institution to exercise accountability as well. Now, in principle, we might envision a trade-off between optimal policy and democratic process. John Stuart Mill, I believe, once said that the true test of a small d Democrat was whether he were willing to let democracies make their own mistakes. Now, if forced to choose, I probably would prefer a good policy that is subject to democratic control over a perfect policy that is not. But in practice, in recent decades, we have not had to face this choice in the United States. Now, I adopt... Sorry. There we go. I adopt a framework of accountability with three elements. General acceptance of the right of Treasury to exercise particular authorities and that of the Congress to hold it to account. Standards for assessing whether the power wielder has properly discharged his or her responsibilities, and sufficient transparency to assess whether standards have been met. Now, the first prerequisite is firmly nailed down in the Constitution, as I've mentioned, which gives Congress the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. So Congress delegates to Treasury, which is formally accountable to the legislature. The same with the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. Now, standards for assessment, the second element, are partial and incomplete with respect to exchange rate policy in this country, though. And the third prerequisite, sufficient transparency, is supposed to be addressed by the exchange rate reports. The Exchange Rates and International Economic Coordination Act of 1988 were forged in the trade debates of the 1980s, became part of the Trade Act of 1988, and these established the reporting requirement and mandated the manipulation review. It's interesting to note, I think, that the reporting relationship, and even to some extent the manipulation provisions are similar to those in other issue areas. Other agencies report on foreign investment, trade policy and negotiations, monetary policy, foreign intelligence. So the exchange rate report is not unique in terms of the balance of expertise between Congress and the executive, the sensitivity of markets to information, or the engagement of third parties in the form of foreign governments. And these factors have sometimes been used as rationale to limit reporting on exchange rate policy, but other agencies not only complied, but embraced their reporting requirements. Now, my research assistant, Marco Klaschnia, who I wish to acknowledge for his work on this project, including with respect to the tables and charts. Marco, why don't you stand up and wave a hand? This project, this project is much improved by his kind of superior research assistants. While I'm at it, I also wish to thank those people who made themselves accessible to me for interviews. I want to thank Fred for his interest and support of my research in this subject, this project in particular. Now, Marco and I have together probably read every word of all of the 36 exchange rate reports that Treasury has submitted since October 1988. I've subjected this record, to 3 tests. The narrowest test is whether the report meets the content requirements of the Act. The second is whether they provide the basis for informed oversight. And the broadest test asks whether the reports address policies and problems that the markets, the public, and Congress care about. I'm actually concerned with all 3 of these. The empirical record, the empirical section in the book, takes the reader through key points and issues over the last 20 years and asks how these were treated in those reports. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. I'm going to highlight a few elements of that reading. The findings of manipulation in 1988-94 is the first topic treated in depth. Remember that Taiwan, South Korea, and China were found by the Bush 1 administration to have manipulated their currencies, and the administration pursued negotiations with them for remedial action. The section deals with the Mexican peso crisis and the Asian financial crisis. These were cases in which over as opposed to undervaluation had consequences for the system and the United States. The Japanese yen, Europe's monetary union, fiscal policy. I think discourse in this country about the relationship between fiscal policy on the one hand and the current account position and the exchange rate on the other is seriously lacking. These reports have done nothing or very little to improve that national conversation, despite a mandate in the '88 Act to address that topic. The last issue is China, to which I'll return in a moment. Now, the overall assessment I have is this. For much of the period since 1988, the reports were often submitted quite late, and in a few cases not at all. They avoided a number of policy questions that were the focus of contemporary interest, and they were backward-looking and more descriptive than analytical. There was considerable variation over time. The Bush 1 reports were the high point of the accountability process, but the early Bush 2 reports were the low point. And while the reports generally satisfied the content requirements of the Act, sometimes they fell short, and more often they were insufficient as a basis for oversight. The responsibility for the quality of these reports rests squarely with the political appointees in the department, as opposed to staff, kind of beginning with the Secretary. Now, I have 2 partial qualifications to this finding. The first is that the exchange rate reports were supplemented by other statements on exchange rate policy from Treasury officials, such as speeches and press briefings. The second qualification is that the reports do improve noticeably after 2005 under the leadership of Undersecretary Tim Adams, with Mark Sobel, Bob Doner, and undoubtedly others contributing to their enhancement. These reports give more attention to the relationship between fiscal policy and the external balance and the potential risks of growing external indebtedness. They include appendices on sovereign wealth funds and capital flows. The assessment of the exchange rate issues is broader, and the most recent reports are critical of Chinese policy and recommend specific changes, including appreciation. And Treasury officials deserve substantial credit for the improvement. However, this improvement could be reversed by a future administration, and the reports still fail to find manipulation in a blatant case. Now, as you can see, the timing, the report has almost never been submitted on time. These bars show the number of reports that were submitted at varying intervals of lateness. This finding that one report was submitted on or before the deadline date is a generous reading of the record. You can see that at least a third were late up to 1 month, and a quarter of them up to 2 months late, and the remainder were up to 3 months late or never submitted. Now, I'll come back to this slide momentarily if we have time. I want to focus on the comparison of these reports to the Fed's reports on monetary policy under the Humphrey-Hawkins legislation. These reports I find to be mildly informative about FOMC thinking and inflation forecasts. And the Fed has a good record of meeting its dual mandate, at least so far, and it delivers the report consistently on time. It's interesting that the Fed was skeptical about this reporting requirement when it was introduced 30 years ago, but it grew to embrace the reports as a communication tool, and I list here Ben Bernanke's effusive statement about this requirement. Although there are some differences between monetary and exchange rate policy, my bottom line from this comparison is that there is considerable room for Treasury to embrace the report as part of a modern communication strategy and accountability mechanism. Now, on the question of China, foreign exchange intervention on the part of China over the last 5 years is historically unprecedented. It harms the international monetary system and I believe threatens its political underpinnings. This is not an issue on which U.S. and Chinese national interests, correctly interpreted, are opposed. Both countries would be better off with faster appreciation of the renminbi. My colleagues at the Institute have made this argument with compelling clarity, as well as the argument that Chinese policy behavior constitutes manipulation under the terms of the IMF's Articles of Agreement. Now, this book argues that Chinese policy also constitutes manipulation under the 1988 Act. But Treasury, while acknowledging the renminbi is undervalued and encouraging faster appreciation, refuses to designate for manipulation on a couple of stated grounds. First, on the technical grounds that it cannot identify intent to block payments adjustment and seek unfair competitive advantage. The book points out that U.S. policy need not be stymied by the IMF's hang-up about intent, because it's guided by U.S. law, legislative history, and congressional intent, rather than the opinions of the IMF's General Counsel. And intent proved no bar to designating China for manipulation in 1992. Second, Treasury cites model uncertainty. Econometric models produce different estimates of the degree of undervaluation of the renminbi. And I argue that in the presence of massive and accelerating foreign exchange intervention and very large and rising current account surpluses, we do not need a model to tell us that currency is undervalued and that government action is preventing adjustment. In sum, I don't believe the Secretary and his predecessors in this administration have adhered to the mandate of the 1988 Act. Others have used more colorful language, such as a dereliction of duty, which is Morris Goldstein's phrase, I believe, and with respect to the fund's refusal to designate malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance, which is Mike Moose's colorful phrase. But Treasury has, of course, pursued negotiations with China in any case. So long as Treasury secures an appreciation, one might ask, what's the big deal about designation? And on this point, Dan Tarullo accused me of arguing like a lawyer, giving precedence to procedure over substance. He intended this as a criticism. I took it as a compliment. The process is actually important to me, but Treasury hasn't received enough substance either. The nominal appreciation of the bilateral exchange rate has barely kept pace with China's rapid increases in productivity in the traded goods sector, and the renminbi's depreciation against the euro is perverse. Beyond the merits, there are four considerations that argue for Treasury using the M word rather than bypassing designation on the way toward negotiations. First of all, designation is important from the standpoint of process and accountability. The Act lays down a specific procedure. The Treasury Department is to assess, designate, initiate negotiations or waive them, and if negotiations proceed, report on them. While the Secretary can waive negotiations on grounds of vital national economic and security interest once a designation has been made, he cannot skip the designation when that is warranted by the facts. Moreover, in the strategic economic dialogue, Treasury addresses the exchange rate along with a number of other negotiating objectives, and trade-offs are inevitably made among them. But the law doesn't provide for using manipulation, or the manipulation issue, as leverage for concessions on other issues, such as access to Chinese market for U.S. financial institutions, to choose an issue out of the air. The negotiations are supposed to ensure that manipulators adjust the rate of exchange to permit effective balance of payments adjustments and to eliminate the unfair advantage. So negotiating without designating redirects bargaining in ways the law does not intend and weakens oversight. Second, designating would signal the domestic public that the Treasury Department is serious about combating the practice. Calling a spade gives greater confidence that the U.S. government recognizes the problem and is moving to solve it. Designating would send a signal to the international community that Treasury is not only serious, but expects others to cooperate. And conversely, the U.S. government can't realistically expect the fund to challenge large members on their currency practices unless Treasury is willing to do so as well. And finally, designation would strengthen Treasury's bargaining position with manipulators and improve their prospects for remediation. Accountability reinforces the U.S. bargaining position, I believe. I don't buy the suggestion that Chinese officials will be offended and walk away. They might indeed be offended, and I care about that, but this cannot be the consideration that guides relations among great powers. Beijing has demonstrated pragmatism on a number of other economic matters, and I expect that after strenuous protests, it will be pragmatic on this issue as well. Now, Chapter 5 in the book documents follow-up on the part of Congress on the reports. 24 hearings have been held since 1988, and these were a subgroup of hearings devoted to broader issues of international finance. There is a roughly equal number of hearings at which the exchange rate was extensively discussed, such as during the Mexican and Asian financial crises, and a larger number still in which the exchange rate was a minor player. But the regular reports represent the core of the exchange rate policy oversight process. Now a longer table in the book is condensed into this table here, listing all 24 hearings. Multiple hearings were held on some reports. Hearings were held on 15 of the 36 reports presented, less than half. Members have not chosen to hold hearings on the last 2 reports. in part because congressional Democrats have not wanted to give Treasury a platform to critique the currency bills that they've been developing. But it comes at a bad time when the Chinese current account surplus has been growing strongly. Notice here as well the 7-year gap in follow-up from 1995 to 2001. Now, when trade issues were prominent, particularly involving countries that manipulated their currencies, members of Congress were fairly diligent in their oversight of Treasury on exchange rates. Democrats followed up more diligently than their Republican counterparts. As chairman, the Senate Banking Committee followed up more regularly than its House counterpart, and members of Congress have typically been reactive rather than proactive. They have sometimes, but not always, asked the right questions. Congress dropped the ball with respect to 2 substantive issues in particular: the dollar's value on an effective basis, and as part of that, its relationship to the euro, and overvaluation as opposed to cases of undervaluation. Now, given the record of Treasury and Congress in this process, what constructive proposals can we offer for a more functional relationship? And my recommendations are grouped under these headings: preparing the reports, general objectives, manipulation, countermeasures. I'm going to insert a heading that I call reinforcing the IMF, and congressional oversight. Now, without changes in the law, Treasury can simply decide to write the reports in a more forthcoming way. Changes since 2005 are welcome improvements, but Treasury can further embrace the reporting process, using it to guide the terms of domestic discourse, signal the international community, and in general advance its policy more fully. And the book provides some specifics as to how this could be done. Congress could define the exchange rate policy mandate for Treasury more comprehensively and specify the standards by which execution of policy should be assessed. The broad mandate would place the exchange rate in a general equilibrium framework in which policymakers can sometimes safely treat the exchange rate as the residual of macroeconomic policies, but would recognize 3 circumstances in which active exchange rate policy is warranted: when external deficits become large and potentially unfinanceable, when foreign exchange markets become unhinged from the fundamentals, and when foreign governments intervene directly or indirectly. The mandate should have Treasury assess whether those circumstances apply, and if they do, take appropriate action. I regard this as substantively relatively innocuous and able to accommodate alternative analytical approaches to open economy macroeconomics. I'm not asking Treasury to pursue target zones or resurrect the Bretton Woods regime here. Now, counteracting currency undervaluation has been the focus of many bills in Congress over the last several years. This table displays those that have been introduced so far during the 110th Congress. The momentum on these bills dissipated over the last several months owing to opposition from multinational corporations and to the depreciation of the dollar against the euro and yen, but the issue could be revived by dollar appreciation, larger Democratic majorities in Congress, and a Democratic president after the fall election. Note that Senator Barack Obama has co-sponsored the second and third bills listed here, Baucus, Grassley, Schumer, Graham, and Bunning, Stabenow, Bayh, providing for, respectively, anti-dumping and countervailing duty penalties against recalcitrant manipulators. Now, this book assiduously avoids endorsing one of these bills over the others. Instead, I list a couple of considerations and principles for legislation in this area. The concept of manipulation should be retained, not jettisoned in favor of misalignment. New legislation should provide for a finding of manipulation in one of 2 possible ways. First, with evidence as background, it's important to say that the law as currently written, doesn't actually define manipulation very clearly. So listing it in this way, I think, is an advance. In one of two possible ways. First, with evidence of large, protracted, unidirectional intervention which perpetuates or accentuates a significant current account imbalance. This alone should qualify as manipulation. Whether a country sterilizes intervention or allows domestic liquidity effects to manifest in the price level, I think, comes under this fourth point. Now, second, when the currency is in misalignment, manipulation can be found with a reference to a basket of the remaining indicators in the fund's recently revised guidelines on exchange rate policy. Those are an unsustainable level of official borrowing or lending, restrictions or incentives on current transactions or capital flows, abnormal encouragement or discouragement of capital flows, and large external vulnerabilities arising from private capital flows. Now, this double avenue is desirable because the intervention avenue has the benefit of concreteness. It avoids debates about intent and model uncertainty, and it focuses on the most commonly used instruments by which some monetary authorities have blocked adjustment in practice. The basket prevents governments from evading a designation by shifting to other means of managing the exchange rate when intervention is effectively blocked or discouraged in this way. Now, neither avenue completely eliminates discretion on the part of the Treasury Department. Treasury can't be directed to apply the indicators mechanistically, nor does the basket of indicators break new conceptual ground. But placing these criteria in U.S. law would foster at least partial consistency with IMF guidelines, narrow the scope for discretion, and facilitate assessment of whether Treasury is sticking to its legal mandate. Now, the most contentious element of the current bills is the countermeasures to be taken when a designated country refuses to cease manipulation. These include countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, bringing a case in the WTO under Article 15, Section 4, in addition to use of or denial of Exim Bank financing and regional development bank financing and so forth. I haven't examined the effectiveness and legal viability of all of these proposals. Gary Huffbauer and Claire Brunel have done this in a recent chapter in an IIE book and a Peterson Institute book. I here just list a couple of observations that I think are worth making. And the first is that currency undervaluation is indeed similar to a tax on imports and a subsidy on exports. Trade measures that compensate for this distortion can, in principle, enhance both economic efficiency and fairness in trade. But it's important to note that import measures do not address the export side of this equation. And these measures should be applied only in cases of manipulation as opposed to market-induced misalignment. They should be proportionate to the effect of manipulation as best as we can measure it, and removed when manipulation ceases or are found to be inconsistent with the WTO. Now, I believe that all advocates of such measures recognize that these are third best options, not first best options. But some of us believe that they're better than no action at all when the first best option is not now attainable. I see these as consistent with multilateral norms and rules in two ways. First, they can reinforce the fund's norms and rules against beggar thy neighbor undervaluation. Most international institutions have difficulty enforcing hard rules because, among other reasons, they entrust enforcement to bodies in which the targets themselves are members. When rules are effective, they're often supported by national measures. And this is my reading of the WTO and the United Nations Security Council, for example. But the IMF, even if it is more forceful during the current round of Article 4 consultations, lacks tools to enforce compliance. U.S. actions can fill this gap. Second, any use by the United States of anti-dumping or countervailing duties to combat currency manipulation would meet objections that it is acting with heavy-handed unilateralism. This would be analogous to the aggressive use of Section 301 and Super 301 after passage of the '88 Trade Act. As part of the Uruguay Round agreements, though, the United States effectively traded this off for an enhanced dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO, which is now regarded as quite successful. Analogously, an appropriate response to objections to exchange rate unilateralism would be to trade off these countermeasures for more robust enforcement of the fund's rules on exchange rate policy. Although it would have initially involved the use of trade measures, such an agreement would ultimately shift the system toward the first best solution. Finally, the separation of trade from exchange rate policy in different congressional committees replicates the stovepiping of these issues within the executive, within international organizations, and was pointed out to me a couple of times during my rounds of interviews within research institutes. The separation impedes linkages between these areas that is sometimes vitally important. To help draw those linkages, Congress should regularize multi-committee participation in oversight of exchange rate and international monetary policies by inviting members of the Trade and Budget Committees to hearings of the Banking Committee and facilitating staff cooperation on follow-ups to the report and legislation. I think these could contribute to greater continuity in oversight over time and make it more proactive. The leadership of the House and Senate should also be more proactive in coordinating committee work, brokering bargains, and otherwise managing these linkages. Now, this debate over the balance of authority between the two branches of government goes back to the founding of the American Republic, and I'd be surprised if we were able to resolve it today. As the leading Republican, Thomas Jefferson advocated for primacy of the legislative branch as closest to the electorate and the best guarantor against tyranny. He argued at times bitterly with Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist and advocate of primacy of the executive. Nonetheless, as first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton was called upon to submit and delivered 4 seminal reports on finance and trade to the first and second Congresses. These reports kind of set a high standard for clarity and analysis, a standard that I'm asking the current Secretary to replicate in his own exchange rate reports. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and your comments.